Let's take a look at the different types of blood vessels and the basic structure of a blood vessel. Taking a look at this picture from our book, we can see that there are three main layers that make up both arteries and veins, and actually arterioles and venules too. So taking a look at the picture, we can see the inner layer of a blood vessel is called the tunica intima, also known as the tunica interna, and the bullet points below show us that this inner layer has many different sublayers, but the main area that I want to focus on is the endothelium. Remember that the endothelium is simple squamous epithelial tissue. All blood vessels are lined with endothelium. Okay, so the tunica interna is basically that endothelial layer that contacts the blood. Outside of that is a layer called the tunica media. The tunica media is a smooth muscle layer, also contains elastic fibers. And when we look at the smooth muscle layer in an artery, I can see that the smooth muscle layer, or in other words, the tunica media, is very thick in an artery compared to a vein. Take a look at the thickness of the tunica media here. It's much thinner, so veins are less muscular. And then the outermost layer of a blood vessel is called the tunica externa, and that's basically just the connective tissue coat. And so taking a look at the artery, we can see there's the connective tissue coat. And when I look at the tunica externa of a vein, I can see that that's much thicker. So there's more connective tissue outside of the vein. But all blood vessels have the same basic structure, that the inner layer is called the tunica interna or intima, that's the endothelial layer, that the middle layer is smooth muscle, that's called the tunica media, and that the outer layer is the tunica externa. So taking a look at slide, you can see that the thicker tunica media, the thicker smooth muscle layer, is causing the artery to retain its shape much better. The vein has a weaker muscular wall, and I can see that the thickness is not as much, and also we notice how the vein is not retaining its shape as well. Taking a look at another example, can you tell which one is the artery and which one is the vein here? Hopefully you're thinking this vessel is the artery because it has a thicker wall and it's retaining its shape better because it's more muscular, compared to this is the vein. It's bigger because it's stretched out, because it's not as muscular, and it's even, kind of flattening out. It's not retaining its shape. So taking a look again at the different types of blood vessels, we have 5 different types of blood vessels. There is what's called an artery, and then arteries lead into basically like a small artery called an arteriole. Arterioles convey blood into a capillary bed. And then there's basically a small vein. This is called the venule. And venules convey blood into the vein, and the vein returns blood to the heart. So let's take a look at these 5 different types of blood vessels, starting with the artery, then moving into the arteriole, capillary, venule, vein. So starting with the artery, arteries carry high pressure blood away from the heart. Sometimes people say that arteries carry oxygenated blood, and some do and some don't. So you got to be careful with that. But artery starts with the letter A, and remember it carries blood away from the heart. That's always the case. So arteries are going to carry high pressure blood away from the heart. Arteries have a well-developed smooth muscle wall, the tunica media, and we just took a look at that. But the significance of that is that because there is a thick smooth muscle layer, that's going to be able to control the diameter of the vessel. And so in arteries, you can see something called vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction would be when the smooth muscle contracts, and that decreases the diameter of the vessel. You can also see something called vasodilation, and vasodilation is the opposite. That's when the smooth muscle wall of the vessel relaxes and the diameter gets bigger. So taking a look at the next type of vessel, the arteriole. The arteriole is just the small artery. It has the same 3 layers. It has a tunica interna, tunica media, tunica externa. It's like a small artery, and what it does is it conveys blood into a capillary bed. And so taking a look at that, we can see that the arteriole is going to have the ability to perfuse a capillary bed with blood, or if there was vasoconstriction in an arteriole, that arteriole could limit blood flow into a capillary bed. So arterioles convey blood into capillary beds, and they also control the amount of blood going into a capillary bed. Taking a look at capillaries, we know that capillaries are only 1 cell layer thick, just that simple squamous, the endothelium, and therefore all exchange that occurs between the blood and the surrounding fluid tissue will occur through a capillary, and that typically occurs through diffusion. So, in other words, just the individual items will move across the wall of the capillary bed. Blood will be contained within the capillary, but nutrients, waste products, oxygen, carbon dioxide, that kind of thing, those individual items will just move by diffusion across that single layer. You can see we have 3 different types of capillaries. We have continuous capillaries, fenestrated capillaries, and what's known as a sinusoid. So let's take a look at each one of these one by one. Basically, the difference between them is that the continuous capillary is least porous. In other words, the endothelial cells are joined together more tightly, and there are also no pores in those cells, compared to the fenestrated capillary. That's a little bit more porous. You can see that there are pores, or what are called fenestrations, in the cells. And then the most porous capillary is the sinusoid, where there are big gaps in between the cells and large pores within the cells. So let's take a look at each of these one by one. The continuous capillary is the most common type of capillary. It's also the least permeable, although there are little gaps in between the cells. You can see that they're showing pinocytosis is occurring. So in other words, active transport is going to be one way to exchange substances between the blood and the surrounding tissue. The next type of capillary is a fenestrated capillary, and fenestrated capillaries have large fenestrations, or the pores. So these little pores that they're showing us in the wall, those are called fenestrations. And so you can see these are pretty porous. These are going to be in areas like the kidney and the small intestine, where a lot of exchange is taking place. And then the most porous type of capillary is something called a sinusoid. The sinusoid, that's the most permeable. It's also, the most limited. There are gaps in between the cells where items can get into the blood. And so when you think about, like where would a sinusoid be, think about the liver. The liver produces protein that is part of the blood. And so you might wonder, how would the liver put large proteins into the blood? And this is how, because the type of blood vessel in the liver is something called a sinusoid. Another type of vessel is a venule. Venules, that's the vessel that's going to convey blood from the capillary bed back into the vein. Venules are basically like small veins, and so let's just move on and look at the veins. Veins return low pressure blood to the heart. Sometimes people talk about deoxygenated blood, and that could be the case, or it might not be the case. It depends, but veins are always carrying low pressure blood back to the heart, and because of that, veins contain valves to prevent backflow. And so taking a look at this picture, we can see that a valve is just literally like a little flap inside of the vein. So as long as blood is flowing in the right direction, it just pushes right past those 2 little pieces of tissue that we see, the valve. But if there was backflow, that blood would go behind the valve and it would close the valve. And so these valves in the veins are working similar to the valves in the heart, in that they are actively opening and closing. Just as long as blood's flowing in the right direction, it pushes past the valve. But if blood flows in the wrong direction, that's going to work to close the valve. And then last, veins have thinner tunica media, and so they aren't as muscular. We looked at this already at the start of the video, and that is a reason that veins can stretch out.